The music had not even finished playing when Elena Voss felt her hands begin to shake. She stood at the altar in a white dress that was not her choice, in a hall that was not her home, waiting to marry a man who would not look at her. Marcus stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the door behind them, his jaw tight, his fingers cold against hers. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, the way every wolf in the room seemed to be holding their breath at once. Elena had grown up knowing she would never be chosen. In a pack where strength and beauty decided everything, being born an Omega meant being placed at the bottom before she had even taken her first breath. Her cousins were louder, prettier, stronger. They were the ones invited to dance at gatherings, the ones whose names were whispered with excitement when a strong alpha walked into a room. Elena was the one people forgot to introduce. So when her father told her that Marcus, a beta from a respected family, had agreed to marry her, she did not argue. She understood exactly what this was. It had nothing to do with love. Her father's business was failing, and Marcus's family controlled trade routes that could save it. Elena was simply the payment. She told herself this was still better than the alternative. Better than growing old alone, whispered about, pitied. Better than being the Omega nobody wanted forever. A marriage without love was still a marriage. It still meant she belonged somewhere. But standing here now, in front of 200 guests who had come more to see the business alliance sealed than to celebrate her happiness, Elena felt none of the peace she had promised herself she would feel. She felt only the tight knot in her chest that had been growing for weeks, the quiet voice inside her that kept whispering that something about this day was wrong. The officiant, an older wolf named Halden, cleared his throat and opened the old leather book that held the binding words. The hall fell silent. Rows of guests in fine clothing turned their attention forward. Elena's father sat in the front row, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping against his knee in a rhythm that betrayed his impatience. He was not looking at his daughter. He was looking at Marcus's father, exchanging a small, satisfied nod, as though this wedding were nothing more than the final signature on a contract. Elena swallowed hard and looked at Marcus one more time, searching for any sign of warmth, any flicker of comfort. He gave her nothing. His eyes were somewhere else entirely, somewhere past her shoulder, toward the back of the hall, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that a small muscle jumped beneath his skin. "We are gathered here," Halden began, his voice deep and steady, "to witness the binding of two lives, two names, two futures." Elena tried to focus on the words, tried to find some comfort in the ceremony itself, in the tradition that had bound generations of wolves before her. But her mind kept circling back to the same unanswered question. Why did Marcus look more nervous than a groom should look? Why did her father seem more relieved than happy? And why, when she had woken that morning, had she felt a strange pull deep in her chest, as if something inside her were reaching for a place she had never been? She had told herself it was nerves. Every bride felt nerves, but this was different. This felt like her body knew something her mind did not. "Elena Voss," Halden continued, turning toward her with the book raised, "do you come to this binding freely, with your heart and your word?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Elena opened her mouth to answer, the single word she had rehearsed so many times sitting right at the edge of her tongue. She never had the chance to say it. The great doors at the back of the hall burst open with such force that the heavy wood cracked against the stone walls. A gust of cold air swept down the aisle, extinguishing half the candles that lined the hall, and sending the white flower petals scattered along the floor spinning into the air. Every guest turned at once. Every head bowed low, almost as if by instinct, before anyone had even seen who stood in the doorway. Elena felt it before she saw it. A pressure in the room, heavy and undeniable, pressing down on every wolf present like an invisible hand. It was the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself, because every creature in the room already understood, on some deep and ancient level, exactly what it meant. An Alpha King had entered the hall. Elena had heard stories about Alpha Kings her entire life, the way children hear stories about legends too large to be entirely real, rulers who commanded entire territories, whose word could end wars or start them, whose presence alone could make even the strongest Alpha lower their gaze. She had never expected to see one in person, let alone at her own wedding. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, silhouetted against the daylight behind him, tall and still, his dark coat moving slightly in the wind that had followed him inside. Then he began to walk. His footsteps were unhurried, deliberate, echoing through the silent hall, with a weight that made Elena's pulse quicken. Guests shrank back in their seats as he passed, some lowering their eyes entirely, unable to hold his gaze. Elena, however, could not look away. She did not know why. She only knew that as he came closer, the strange pull she had felt that morning grew stronger, until it was no longer a whisper, but a roar inside her chest. Marcus took a step back from her, as if trying to distance himself from whatever was happening. Halden closed the leather book slowly, his hands trembling. The Alpha King stopped at the base of the altar. Up close, he was even more overwhelming than he had seemed from a distance, his eyes a shade of gray so pale they looked almost silver, sharp and unblinking, fixed entirely on Elena. "Stop this ceremony," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried through the hall, as if it had been spoken directly into every ear at once. A murmur broke out among the guests, quickly silenced by another look from the man at the altar. Elena's father shot to his feet, his face flushing with anger and confusion. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty," he said quickly, his voice strained with forced politeness, "but this ceremony has been arranged for months. I do not understand." "You will understand shortly," the Alpha King said, without even glancing at him. His attention remained entirely on Elena. She stood frozen, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. She did not know this man. She had never seen him before in her life, and yet something inside her recognized him in a way she could not explain, a recognition that came not from memory, but from somewhere far deeper. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "My name is Damien Cross," he said, "and you are not marrying him." The words landed like a struck bell, ringing through the silence of the hall. Marcus's face went pale. Elena's father opened his mouth to protest again, but before he could speak, Damien turned his head slightly, just enough to address the entire room, without ever fully looking away from her. "I have searched for this woman for months," he said. "I did not know her name until I felt her in this room, from the moment I crossed into this territory. Some of you may not understand what that means. Let me be clear. She is my mate." The word hit the hall like a wave, spreading outward in gasps and murmurs, guests turning to each other in disbelief. Elena felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. Mate. The word alone was enough to change everything, and yet she could not fully grasp what it meant, not standing here, not with 200 eyes suddenly fixed on her instead of the man beside her. Marcus finally found his voice. "This is absurd," he said, though the tremor in his tone betrayed his fear. "She is promised to me. This union has already been arranged." "An arrangement means nothing against a bond," Damien said, his tone still calm, still terrifyingly controlled. "You know this as well as I do. Every wolf in this hall knows this." Elena looked at Marcus, waiting for him to argue further, to defend the marriage he had barely seemed to want in the first place. But he said nothing. He only looked away, toward his father, as if searching for guidance that would not come. "This is a mistake," Elena's father said, stepping forward now, his voice rising with desperation rather than anger. "Your Majesty, surely there has been some confusion. My daughter is not. I felt the bond the moment I crossed the border of this territory 3 days ago," Damien said, cutting him off without raising his voice at all. "I have spent 3 days confirming it. There is no confusion." Elena's mind raced. 3 days. He had known for 3 days, and had said nothing until now, until the very last possible moment. Why wait? Why let the ceremony begin at all, if he had known this entire time? As if sensing her question, Damien's gaze softened, just slightly, the sharp edge in his eyes easing when he looked at her. "I did not want to interrupt your life, without understanding what it was I was interrupting," he said, quieter now, as though the words were meant only for her, even though the entire hall could still hear them. "I needed to know why you were being given away like this, before I claimed what was already mine." Elena's breath caught. There was something in the way he said it, something that made the humiliation she had carried her entire life feel, for just a moment, unimportant. The hall had fallen into complete silence now, every guest watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Elena looked at Marcus one final time. He would not meet her eyes. She looked at her father, whose face had gone from anger to something closer to fear, as though he understood, finally, that the alliance he had built his hopes on was already lost. Then she looked back at Damien Cross, the Alpha King who had walked into her wedding and stopped it with nothing but his voice. "Why me?" she asked, so quietly that only he could hear it. "Because the bond does not choose based on rank," he said. "It never has. Only people do that." Elena felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed shut for years, ever since she first understood what it meant to be an Omega nobody wanted. She did not know this man. She did not know what claiming her would mean, or what her life would look like after this moment. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel invisible. Behind her, Halden the officiant slowly closed the ceremony book and stepped back from the altar, understanding, as everyone in the hall now did, that no vows would be spoken here today. Marcus's father rose from his seat, his face dark with fury, already turning toward Elena's father, as though searching for someone to blame. Whispers rippled through the crowd once more, louder this time, no longer able to be silenced by a single glance. Elena barely heard any of it. She was still looking at Damien, at the stranger who had somehow known, before she did, that she was never meant to stand at this altar at all. "What happens now?" she asked. Damien extended his hand toward her, not as a command, but as a question of his own, one that gave her the choice no one else in her life had ever given her. "Now," he said, "you decide whether you want to walk out of this hall with me." Elena looked down at his hand. She thought of every year she had spent believing she was unwanted, every whispered comment, every arrangement made without her voice ever mattering. She thought of Marcus, who had never once looked at her the way Damien was looking at her now. And for the first time in her life, Elena Voss made a choice that belonged entirely to her. She placed her hand in his. The moment Elena's hand touched his, a wave of murmurs turned into open shouting. Marcus's father shoved his way toward the altar, his face red with fury, pointing a finger first at Elena, then at Damien. "You cannot simply walk into another territory and steal a bride from her own wedding," he shouted. "This is an insult to my family, to this entire pack." Damien did not release Elena's hand. He turned toward the man slowly, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop with the movement. "I did not steal anything that was not already mine," Damien said. "If your son wishes to challenge that, he is welcome to try." Marcus flinched at the words, taking a half step back instead of forward. Whatever anger he might have felt was clearly outweighed by fear. No beta in his right mind would challenge an Alpha King, not when the bond itself had already spoken. Elena's father, still pale, tried a different approach, softening his voice into something that resembled pleading rather than command. "Your Majesty, please, consider the position this puts our families in. Contracts have been signed. Debts have been arranged around this union. If it does not go forward, the consequences will be severe." At those words, something shifted in Elena's chest, not surprise, but a kind of grim confirmation. Debts, contracts. He had never once mentioned love, or happiness, or even her comfort. Only debts. Damien's gray eyes moved toward her father, cold and unreadable. What kind of debts? Her father hesitated, clearly realizing he had said too much. "Business matters. Nothing that concerns the ceremony itself." "It concerns me a great deal," Damien said, "considering it appears my mate was being used as payment for them." The word payment rippled through the crowd like a slap. Elena felt her cheeks burn, not from embarrassment this time, but from something closer to anger. She had always known, on some level, that her marriage to Marcus was a transaction. She had accepted it, because she believed she had no other option, because she had been taught her entire life that an Omega like her should be grateful for any offer at all. But hearing it said aloud, in front of everyone, stripped away whatever comforting illusion she had built around the arrangement. "Is that true?" she asked her father, her voice steadier than she expected. "Was I only ever a price to pay off what you owed?" Her father's mouth opened, then closed again. He glanced toward Marcus's father, then back at her, searching for words that would soften the truth. He found none. "Elena, you must understand the position our family was in," he said instead. "This was never meant to hurt you." "It doesn't matter what it was meant to do," she said. "It matters what it did." The hall had gone quiet again, guests watching the unraveling of a family in real time, the kind of spectacle no one wanted to look away from. Damien remained silent beside her, allowing her the space to speak, though Elena could feel the tension radiating from him, barely restrained. "I think," Damien said finally, breaking the silence, "that everyone in this hall deserves to know exactly what kind of arrangement they were witnessing today." He turned to face the guests fully now, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room without him needing to raise it. "This was not a wedding built on love, or even respect," he said. "It was a transaction, dressed in white and flowers, meant to settle a debt between two families, at the expense of a woman who was never given a real choice. I imagine many of you already suspected as much. Perhaps some of you were simply too polite to say it." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether to agree or defend the families they had come to support. Marcus's father stepped forward again, though with noticeably less confidence than before. Whatever the reasons behind this union, it was still a legal and binding agreement between two families. "You have no authority here to dissolve it." "I have every authority," Damien said, the moment the bond declared her mine. "No contract between two men outweighs that. Not in this territory, not in any territory." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Marcus's father opened his mouth once more, then thought better of it, his shoulders sinking as he finally accepted the reality of what had just happened. His son's marriage, and whatever financial rescue it had promised, was gone. Elena's father, meanwhile, looked as though the floor had opened beneath him. His plans, his careful arrangements, all of it had unraveled in the span of a few minutes, in front of every important family in the pack. He turned to Elena, his expression pleading now instead of commanding. "Elena, please, think about what you are doing. If this alliance falls apart, everything we have could be lost. Everything I have built for this family." "For this family," Elena repeated quietly. "Not for me." Her father flinched, but did not deny it. Elena felt Damien's hand tighten slightly around hers, not painfully, but as if silently offering support without needing to speak. She looked up at him, and for a moment the noise of the hall seemed to fade into the background. "I don't know you," she said, quiet enough that it was meant only for him. "I don't know anything about your territory, your people, or what being claimed by an Alpha King actually means for someone like me." "Then let me be honest with you now, in front of everyone, so there is no confusion later," Damien said. "Being my mate does not make you a possession. It does not make you a political tool, the way you were meant to be here today. It means you stand beside me as an equal, whether the rest of the world understands that or not." Elena searched his face for any sign of deception, any flicker of the calculation she had seen so often in her father's eyes, in Marcus's, in every arrangement built around her without her consent. She found none, only steady certainty, and something else beneath it that she did not yet have a name for. "And if I say no?" she asked. "If I choose not to go with you?" The hall seemed to hold its breath at the question. Damien's expression did not harden, did not shift into anger or disappointment the way she half expected it to. "Then I leave," he said simply. "The bond does not disappear if you refuse it, but I will not force you to accept something you do not want. You have spent your entire life being given away by other people's decisions. I will not become one more person who does that to you." Elena stared at him, stunned by how plainly he said it, how little effort he made to convince her beyond simply telling her the truth. Every other person in her life had tried to control her choices by wrapping them in guilt, in obligation, in fear of consequences. Damien had done the opposite. He had walked into the most important moment of manipulation in her entire life and, instead of adding to it, had stripped it away entirely, leaving the decision fully in her hands. She thought of every year spent feeling invisible, every gathering where she stood at the edge of the room while others were chosen, admired, wanted. She thought of the years ahead she had imagined for herself, married to a man who barely looked at her, living inside a transaction disguised as a life. And she thought of the strange, undeniable pull she had felt the moment Damien entered the hall, a recognition that came from somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than fear. "I choose to go with you," she said, her voice steady now, carrying clearly through the silent hall. A fresh wave of murmurs broke out among the guests, but this time, Elena did not shrink from it. She stood taller, her hand still resting in Damien's, no longer trembling. Her father took a step toward her, panic flashing across his face. "Elena, please, reconsider. You are making a mistake that will destroy this family." "You made that decision the moment you decided my worth could be measured in debts," she said. "I am simply the first person in this family brave enough to walk away from it." Damien turned toward the doors at the back of the hall, guiding Elena gently beside him, though he paused once more to address the room, his voice carrying a warning beneath its calm surface. "Let it be known," he said, "that any family willing to sell a daughter to settle a debt should not expect protection from consequences when the truth comes to light. I intend to look further into the arrangements made here today, and I suspect what I find will interest more than a few of you." The words landed heavily among the guests, several exchanging uneasy glances, aware that Damien's reach extended far beyond the walls of this single hall. Marcus's father paled further, clearly calculating what secrets might unravel under a king's scrutiny. Elena's father said nothing at all, his silence more telling than any denial could have been. As they reached the doors, Elena glanced back one final time at the hall that had been prepared for her wedding. The flowers, the candles, the guests who had come only for the sake of appearances. None of it had ever truly been meant for her. She turned forward again, toward the daylight waiting beyond the doors, toward a life she had never imagined for herself, standing beside a man she had known for only a few short minutes, yet somehow trusted more than she had ever trusted the people who raised her. Outside, a line of dark vehicles waited, along with several serious-looking men and women, who straightened immediately at the sight of their king. Damien led Elena toward the first vehicle, opening the door for her himself, before any of his guards could move to do it. "Where are we going?" Elena asked, glancing back once more at the hall behind them, the muffled sound of chaos still audible through the open doors. "Home," Damien said. "My home. Which, if you allow it, will become yours as well." Elena took a breath, feeling the last threads of her old life fall away behind her. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the uncertainty ahead of her did not feel like fear. It felt like freedom. She stepped into the vehicle, and Damien closed the door gently behind her. The drive to Damien's territory took most of the afternoon, winding through hills that grew steeper and greener the farther they traveled from Elena's old home. She watched the scenery change through the window, her wedding dress still wrapped tightly around her, feeling more like a costume from someone else's life with every passing mile. Damien sat across from her, quiet for most of the ride, giving her space, rather than filling the silence with unnecessary conversation. Elena appreciated it more than she could say. Her mind was still catching up with everything that had happened. The shouting, the accusations, the sudden and complete collapse of the life she had spent months preparing herself to accept. "You're allowed to ask questions," Damien said eventually, breaking the silence without startling her. "I imagine you have several." Elena considered where to even begin. "How does the bond work? How did you know, from another territory, that I existed at all?" "It isn't something that can be explained perfectly with words," he said. "It's more of a feeling, a pull, one that grows stronger the closer you get to the person connected to you. I felt it 3 days ago, faint at first, like a sound too far away to place. By the time I crossed into your father's territory, it was impossible to ignore." "And you're certain it was me, not someone else in the hall?" "There was no doubt," he said. "The moment I saw you standing at that altar, the pull settled entirely. It doesn't happen with anyone else. It only happens once." Elena turned the words over in her mind, trying to understand what it truly meant to be tied to someone, in a way that could not be explained, only felt. She had spent her whole life being told what she was worth, by other people's opinions, other people's decisions. This was different. This bond had chosen her, without asking permission from anyone, without caring about rank or reputation, or the debts her family owed. "What happens now?" she asked. "What am I supposed to be? In your territory? I don't know the first thing about being a king's mate." "You are not supposed to be anything you don't choose to be," Damien said. "You will have a place in my home, a place in my life, and time to decide what role you want beyond that. No one will expect you to perform a part you were not born into." Elena wanted to believe him completely, but years of caution kept a small, guarded part of her from fully relaxing. She had heard promises before. She had been told, more than once, that things would be different, only to find herself back in the same position, valued for what she could offer rather than who she actually was. "You say that now," she said carefully, "but people change once the excitement of the moment passes. Once your counsel, or your family, or whoever advises you, starts asking questions about the Omega you brought home from another Pax wedding." Something flickered across Damien's face, not offense, but understanding. "You're right to be cautious," he said. "I won't pretend my counsel will greet this news without questions. Some of them will not be pleased that I claimed a mate outside of the arrangements they had hoped for. But questions from my counsel are not the same as decisions made without your consent. I intend to make that distinction very clear, starting the moment we arrive." The vehicle eventually slowed as they passed through a set of tall iron gates, guarded by wolves, who straightened immediately at the sight of the king's car. Beyond the gates stood a sprawling estate, built from pale stone and dark wood, surrounded by gardens that stretched further than Elena could see from the window. It was larger than any home she had ever set foot in, imposing in a way that made her stomach twist with nerves. "This is where you live?" she asked quietly. "This is where we will live," Damien corrected gently. As the car came to a stop, the front doors of the estate opened, and a small group of people stepped out to greet them. Elena recognized authority in the way they stood, the same straightened posture she had seen in the guards at the gate. Among them was an older woman, with sharp eyes and gray-streaked hair, standing slightly ahead of the others. "That is Marin," Damien said quietly, before stepping out of the car. "She has served as an advisor to my family for many years. She can be direct, but her loyalty is not something you need to question." Elena stepped out of the vehicle beside him, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look, still dressed in a wedding gown meant for another man's ceremony, standing in front of strangers who were clearly trying to process the sudden and unannounced arrival of their king's mate. Marin's sharp eyes moved over Elena carefully, taking in every detail, from the dress to the uncertain way she held herself. If she was surprised, she did not show it. "Your Majesty," Marin said, addressing Damien first with a small bow, before turning her attention fully to Elena. "And this must be the reason for your sudden absence these past 3 days." "Elena Voss," Damien said. "My mate." The words settled over the small group gathered at the entrance, expressions shifting from surprise to careful calculation. Elena forced herself to stand straighter, refusing to let the weight of their attention shrink her, the way it always had at home. "Welcome," Marin said finally, her tone polite but measured, giving nothing away about her true feelings on the matter. "I imagine there is quite a story behind this arrival." "There is," Damien said, "and I intend to share the full truth of it with the council this evening, so that no one is left guessing or spreading their own version of events." Marin nodded slowly, though her gaze lingered on Elena a moment longer, unreadable. "Very well. I will gather them." As Marin turned to relay instructions to the others, Damien leaned slightly toward Elena, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "Whatever happens this evening, you do not need to prove anything to anyone. I only ask that you be honest, the way you were with your father today. That honesty is what convinced me you belong here far more than any bond alone could have." Elena appreciated the reassurance, though a small knot of anxiety remained lodged in her chest as she followed him inside the estate. The interior was just as grand as the outside had promised. High ceilings and long hallways lined with portraits she assumed belonged to Damien's family. She felt impossibly small walking through it, though she reminded herself she had felt small in far less impressive places for far less honest reasons. A young woman appeared shortly after their arrival, introducing herself as Priya, one of the household staff assigned to help Elena settle in. She led Elena to a set of rooms on the upper floor, bright and spacious, nothing like the modest bedroom Elena had grown up in. "These are your rooms, if you would like them," Priya said carefully, "though of course, if you prefer to stay closer to His Majesty's quarters, that can be arranged as well." Elena appreciated the option being presented so plainly, without assumption. "These will be fine," she said. "Thank you." Once alone, Elena finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, sitting carefully on the edge of the large bed, still wearing the wedding dress that no longer meant anything at all. She thought of the hall she had left behind, the shouting, her father's panic, Marcus's silence. She thought of the strange, steady presence of the man who had walked into all of it and offered her, for the first time, an actual choice. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Priya returned, carrying a simple set of clothes, along with a gentle explanation that the council meeting would take place within the hour, should Elena wish to attend. Elena changed quickly, grateful to finally remove the dress that had come to represent everything she was walking away from. She studied herself briefly in the mirror before leaving the room, searching her own reflection for some sign of the fear she still felt underneath her calm exterior. She found determination instead, steadier than she expected. Whatever waited for her in that council meeting, whatever questions or doubts Damien's advisors carried about her sudden arrival, Elena decided she would not shrink from it the way she had shrunk from every difficult moment in her old life. She had already survived the collapse of one future today. She would not let fear decide the shape of the next one. The council chamber was smaller than Elena expected. A round room, with a long table at its center, surrounded by tall windows that let in the last golden light of the afternoon. 7 people already sat around the table when she entered beside Damien, each turning to study her with varying degrees of curiosity and caution. Marin sat closest to the head of the table, a folder of papers already open in front of her. Beside her sat a broad-shouldered man Elena did not recognize, his expression unreadable, and further down sat 2 women, deep in quiet conversation, that stopped the moment Elena and Damien walked in. "Please, sit," Damien said, gesturing toward the empty chair beside his own at the head of the table. Elena sat carefully, aware of every eye tracking the movement. "I imagine most of you have already heard some version of today's events," Damien began, addressing the table directly. "I would rather you hear the truth from me than rely on rumors that have likely already begun circulating." He explained everything plainly, the pull he had felt 3 days earlier, his decision to investigate before acting, the wedding he had interrupted, and the debts Elena's father had used her to settle. The council listened in silence, though Elena noticed the broad-shouldered man's jaw tighten at the mention of the arranged marriage. "So the bond confirmed itself the moment you saw her," Marin said, once Damien finished, her tone thoughtful rather than skeptical. "There is no question of its accuracy?" "None," Damien said. "I would not have interrupted a ceremony of that scale without absolute certainty." The broad-shouldered man finally spoke, his voice low and direct. "With respect, Your Majesty, the timing raises concerns beyond the bond itself. We were in the middle of negotiations with the Ashford territory regarding trade rights along the eastern border. An unannounced mate, particularly one connected to a scandal involving unpaid debts, could complicate those discussions considerably." Elena felt her stomach tighten at the mention of complications, at being reduced once again to a problem for someone else's plans. She kept her expression steady, refusing to let the old, familiar shame creep back into her posture. "The Ashford negotiations will proceed as planned, Callum," Damien said evenly. "My mate is not a variable to be managed. She is not a complication. If anyone in this room struggles to understand that distinction, I suggest they reconsider their place at this table." Callum's jaw tightened further, but he said nothing more, lowering his gaze slightly, in a gesture that Elena recognized as reluctant acceptance. One of the women near the end of the table, younger than the others, spoke up carefully. "May I ask a question directly, Elena, if that's permitted?" Elena nodded, grateful for the small courtesy of being addressed at all, rather than discussed, as though she were not present. "Of course. Do you understand what this bond means for your own safety?" the woman asked. "Being connected to an Alpha King carries certain risks, particularly from territories that may see it as an opportunity or a threat." Elena hesitated, unsure how to answer honestly, without revealing just how little she understood about the world she had suddenly stepped into. "I don't fully understand it yet," she admitted. "I only learned this bond existed a few hours ago." The honesty seemed to land better than a rehearsed answer might have. A few expressions around the table softened slightly. "Then allow me to explain briefly," Marin said, glancing toward Damien for permission before continuing. He nodded, and she turned her attention to Elena. "There are territories that do not respect bonds the way ours does. Some rulers have been known to target the mates of powerful alphas, believing that removing or controlling the bond weakens the alpha's authority. It is not a common occurrence, but it is not unheard of either." Elena absorbed the information carefully, a small chill settling over her despite the warmth of the room. Are you saying someone might try to hurt me? I am saying. It is a possibility we prepare for, Marin said, not unkindly. Precaution, not certainty. Damien's hand found Elena's beneath the table, a quiet reassurance that did not require words. You will not be left unprotected, he said. This household takes the safety of its own seriously, and you are now part of that household. The meeting continued for a while longer, discussions shifting toward logistics, the eventual announcement to be made publicly, and how best to address the fallout from Elena's father's exposed debts. Elena listened more than she spoke, absorbing the rhythms of this new world she had stepped into, a world built on alliances and careful words, so different from the quiet resignation she had grown used to in her old life. As the meeting drew to a close, Callum approached Elena briefly, before leaving the room, his earlier hesitation replaced with something closer to respect. Forgive my concerns earlier, he said. It was not meant as a judgment against you personally. I simply did not expect the king's mate to arrive under such circumstances. Neither did I, Elena admitted, and to her surprise, a small, genuine smile crossed Callum's face at the honesty. Once the council had cleared out, Damien guided Elena toward a quieter part of the estate, a private garden tucked behind the main building, filled with the kind of stillness that felt like a relief after the tension of the meeting. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming flowers Elena did not recognize. I know that was a lot to take in, Damien said, walking slowly beside her along the garden path. Bonds, politics, threats you didn't ask to be part of. I wish I could tell you it will get simpler from here, but I would rather be honest with you than comfortable. I appreciate the honesty, Elena said. It's more than I've received from most people in my life. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the events of the day finally beginning to settle into something Elena could process, rather than simply survive. She found herself studying Damien more closely now that the chaos of the wedding hall had passed, noticing the quiet steadiness in the way he carried himself, so different from the careful performances she had grown used to from the men in her old life. Can I ask you something honest in return? Elena said. Always. Why did you wait 3 days? If the bond was that strong, why not come immediately? Damien considered the question carefully before answering. Because bonds are powerful, but they are not permission. I did not want to walk into your life and claim you the way your father tried to give you away, as though your consent was simply assumed. I needed to know who you were first, not just what the bond told me you meant to me. Elena stopped walking, turning to look at him fully. And what did you find, in those 3 days? I found a woman who had been underestimated her entire life by people who should have valued her most, he said. I found someone who agreed to marry a man who didn't want her, not out of weakness, but because she believed that was the only way to survive, in a world that never gave her real choices. And I found that the closer I came to understanding you, the more certain I became that I did not want to be one more person who took your choices away. Elena felt something tighten in her throat, unfamiliar and overwhelming. No one had ever spoken about her with that kind of clarity before, as though her worth had never actually been in question, only overlooked by people too blind or too selfish to see it. I don't know how to be someone people fight to protect, she admitted quietly. I've spent my whole life being the person nobody wanted to bother with. That will change, Damien said. Not because I am telling you it will, but because it already has. You simply haven't had time to see it yet. The garden fell quiet again, the last light of the sun fading into a soft blue evening. For the first time, since the doors of that wedding hall had burst open, Elena allowed herself to fully imagine a future that did not feel like a transaction, a life built not on debts or arrangements, but on something closer to genuine choice. She did not yet know what dangers waited beyond the walls of this estate, what enemies the council had spoken of, or what challenges still lay ahead in a world so different from the one she had left behind. But standing in the quiet garden beside Damien Cross, Elena felt something she had rarely felt in her entire life. She felt safe, and for the first time, she believed she deserved to. 3 weeks passed, and Elena slowly began to find her footing within the walls of the estate. Mornings began with quiet breakfasts alongside Damien before council meetings pulled him away, and afternoons were spent learning the rhythms of a household far larger and more structured than anything she had known before. Priya had become something close to a friend, patiently explaining traditions and expectations, without ever making Elena feel foolish for not already knowing them. Word of the interrupted wedding had spread quickly across neighboring territories, as Elena had expected it would. Most reactions, according to Marin, ranged from curiosity to quiet approval. Sympathy for the Omega, who had nearly been sold into a loveless marriage, resonating with more people than Elena anticipated. Still, not every reaction had been kind. Whispers followed her occasionally during rare trips beyond the estate walls, though she had grown practiced at ignoring them, a skill she had unfortunately perfected long before arriving here. What worried her more than public opinion was the growing tension Marin and Callum discussed in hushed tones whenever they believed Elena was out of earshot. She had caught fragments of conversations mentioning a neighboring territory called Ashford, the same name Callum had raised concerns about during her first council meeting. One afternoon, as Elena sat in the garden reading, Marin approached with an expression more serious than usual. "May I speak with you plainly?" Marin asked, taking the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "Please," Elena said, setting her book aside. "The Ashford territory has requested a formal meeting with His Majesty," Marin said. "Officially, it concerns trade negotiations. Unofficially, I suspect it concerns you." Elena's stomach tightened. "Me? Why would they care about me?" "Ashford's ruler, Victor Kane, has built his reputation on strength and expansion," Marin said. "An alpha king, claiming an unexpected mate, particularly one whose bond was strong enough to interrupt a wedding of that scale, is the kind of story that draws attention from ambitious rulers. Some may see it as an opportunity to test how distracted or vulnerable this territory has become." "Vulnerable because of me," Elena said quietly, the old, familiar guilt creeping back despite her best efforts to keep it away. "Vulnerable because power always attracts those looking to challenge it," Marin corrected firmly. "This has nothing to do with your worth, Elena. It has everything to do with politics that existed long before you arrived." Elena appreciated the correction, though the unease remained. "Does Damien know about this meeting request?" "He does. He has agreed to it, cautiously. Victor Kane is not a ruler known for patience or subtlety, but refusing the meeting entirely would send its own message, one that could be interpreted as fear." That evening, Damien confirmed what Marin had shared, his expression more guarded than Elena had seen since the day they met. "I don't want you concerned by this," he said, though the tension in his voice suggested otherwise. "It is likely nothing more than posturing, an attempt to gauge my priorities, now that the bond has been made public." "But you don't think it's nothing," Elena said, watching him carefully. "I can tell." Damien sighed, running a hand through his hair, a small, human gesture that made him seem less like the untouchable king who had stopped her wedding and more like someone genuinely worried. Victor Kane has spent years expanding his territory through pressure and intimidation rather than open conflict. He is patient in ways that make him dangerous. If he sees an opportunity here, he will not waste it. "What kind of opportunity?" Elena asked. "I don't know yet," Damien admitted, "which is precisely what concerns me." The following week, Victor Kane arrived at the estate with a modest delegation, though his presence alone seemed to fill the space with the same unsettling weight Elena remembered feeling the moment Damien first entered her wedding hall, though colder, sharper somehow. He was tall, with dark hair streaked prematurely gray at the temples, and eyes that studied everything around him with calculated interest. Elena was present at the formal greeting, standing beside Damien as protocol required, though she felt the full weight of Victor's attention settle on her the moment he entered the hall. "So this is the mate everyone has been discussing," Victor said, his tone smooth, almost amused. "The Omega who stopped a wedding hall in its tracks. I confess, I expected someone more remarkable." The insult was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, delivered with a polite smile that did nothing to soften its intent. Elena felt the old sting of familiar humiliation rise in her chest, the same feeling she had carried through years of being overlooked and undervalued. But this time, standing beside Damien, in a home that had already proven itself willing to fight for her, she refused to let it show. "I imagine most remarkable things are underestimated before people take the time to understand them," Elena said evenly. "I hope your visit here proves educational, Victor." A flicker of surprise crossed Victor's face before he recovered, his smile widening slightly, though it no longer reached his eyes. "Sharp tongue. for someone so recently rescued from an arranged marriage. I wasn't rescued, Elena said. I chose to leave. There's a difference, though I imagine that distinction matters less to rulers who prefer arrangements over choices. Damien's hand found the small of her back, a quiet show of support rather than intervention, allowing her to hold her own ground while making clear she was not standing alone. Victor's gaze flicked briefly toward the gesture, before returning to Elena, his expression unreadable now. Careful, Victor said, his tone still light, though something colder moved beneath it. Confidence is admirable, but it can also make a person forget how quickly circumstances can change. Was that a threat? Damien asked, his voice deceptively calm, the same calm Elena had heard the moment he stopped her wedding. Merely an observation, Victor said smoothly. I have found that fortunes shift quickly in this world, Damien. Sometimes even the strongest bonds face challenges no one anticipates. The negotiations that followed were formal and tense, discussions of trade routes and border access carried out with careful diplomacy on the surface, though Elena could sense the undercurrent of something far less friendly running beneath every exchange. She was not permitted to attend the private sessions, a decision Marin had gently explained was standard protocol rather than exclusion, though Elena still found herself pacing the halls anxiously, while the meetings continued behind closed doors. When Damien finally emerged hours later, his expression was carefully composed, though Elena had come to recognize the subtle signs of tension he tried to hide. How did it go? She asked. The trade discussions concluded reasonably, he said. Victor is difficult, but not unreasonable when it comes to business. And the rest of it? Elena pressed. The parts that weren't about trade. Damien hesitated, and Elena realized, not for the first time, how much he tried to shield her from the weight of political concerns, a kindness she appreciated, but did not entirely want. He asked several pointed questions about the strength of our bond, Damien admitted finally, about how newly formed connections sometimes prove less stable than expected under pressure. Is that true? Elena asked. Can bonds weaken? Under extreme circumstances, rarely, yes, Damien said carefully. Though it is not something I am concerned about between us. Elena studied his face, searching for the deeper worry she suspected he was holding back. But you think he might try to create those circumstances? Damien did not answer immediately, and his silence told her everything his words had not. That night, as Elena lay awake long after the estate had gone quiet, she found herself replaying Victor Kane's carefully worded threats, the cold calculation behind his polite smile. She thought of Marin's earlier warning about rulers who saw a mate's bond as a weakness to exploit, rather than a strength to respect. For the first time since walking away from her own wedding, Elena felt the shadow of a new danger settling over the life she had only just begun to build, one that had nothing to do with debts or arrangements, and everything to do with a ruler who seemed determined to test exactly how strong the bond between her and Damien truly was. She did not yet know what form that test would take, but lying awake in the quiet dark, Elena made a silent promise to herself that whatever came, she would not let herself be underestimated again. The weeks following Victor Kane's visit passed with a quiet tension that never fully faded, even as daily life at the estate settled into a steadier rhythm. Damien increased security measures without making a public show of it. Additional guards stationed along the estate's perimeter. Patrols adjusted to cover the surrounding roads more thoroughly. Elena noticed the changes, though no one spoke about them directly, as if naming the concern too openly might somehow make it more real. Elena had begun spending more time with Priya and a few of the household staff, slowly building a life that felt less like borrowed space and more like something belonging to her. She had even started helping organize a small community program Priya ran for younger Omegas in the territory, an initiative meant to teach practical skills and, more importantly, remind them of their worth beyond the roles society often assigned them. It was the first time in her life Elena had felt genuinely useful, valued for what she could offer, rather than what others could take from her. It was during one of these community sessions, held in a modest hall near the edge of the estate grounds, that everything changed. Elena had just finished helping a group of young Omegas practice basic self-defense techniques, something Priya had insisted on including in the program, after hearing pieces of Elena's own history. The afternoon sun slanted warmly through the windows, and laughter filled the room, a lightness Elena had rarely experienced growing up. She stepped outside briefly for fresh air, walking a short distance along the tree-lined path that led back toward the estate. It was a route she had walked dozens of times before, familiar and unremarkable. She did not notice the unfamiliar vehicle parked just beyond the tree line until it was too late. Two figures emerged quickly, their movements practiced and deliberate. Elena's instincts, honed unconsciously over years of learning to read danger in rooms full of people who never valued her, screamed at her to run. She turned immediately, but a firm hand closed around her arm before she could take more than a few steps. "Let go of me," she said sharply, twisting against the grip, though the man holding her was considerably stronger. "This will go easier if you don't fight," the second figure said calmly, stepping closer. "Victor Kane simply wants to have a conversation." The name sent a cold jolt through Elena's chest, confirming every fear that had haunted her since that tense meeting weeks earlier. She struggled harder, managing to twist enough to strike an elbow into the ribs of the man holding her, a technique she had only just finished teaching to a group of young Omegas moments earlier. He grunted, but did not release her. "Help," Elena shouted, her voice carrying across the open path, though the hall she had just left was farther away than she would have liked. The second man moved quickly, pressing a hand roughly over her mouth to muffle the sound. Panic surged through Elena, sharper and more consuming than anything she had felt even in the chaos of her own wedding hall weeks earlier. She fought against the grip holding her, kicking and twisting, refusing to make this easy for them despite the fear tightening in her chest. A sudden shout from the direction of the hall interrupted the struggle. Priya had stepped outside, likely searching for Elena, and her scream immediately drew attention from the guards stationed nearby. Within seconds, the quiet path erupted into chaos, guards rushing forward, shouting orders. The two men holding Elena exchanging a quick, tense look before making a decision. "We're leaving." "Now," the first man snapped, tightening his grip on Elena and beginning to drag her toward the waiting vehicle despite her continued resistance. Elena's mind raced, adrenaline overriding fear entirely. She remembered, suddenly, a lesson Priya had taught the younger Omegas just that afternoon, a technique meant for exactly this kind of situation. She dropped her weight suddenly, forcing the man's grip to shift as he adjusted to catch her, creating just enough space for her to drive her elbow backward again, harder this time, directly into a more vulnerable point along his side. The man's grip loosened with a sharp gasp of pain, giving Elena the fraction of a second she needed. She twisted free and immediately ran, not toward the vehicle, but back toward the hall, toward the sound of approaching guards, and Priya's continued shouting. "Stop her," the second man barked, though the guards were already closing the distance rapidly, several breaking into a full run toward the commotion. Elena did not look back, focusing entirely on the distance between herself and safety, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard the scramble of footsteps behind her, uncertain whether they belonged to her attackers or the guards rushing to help. A strong hand caught her shoulder, just as she reached the edge of the hall's clearing, and Elena spun instinctively, ready to fight, before recognizing one of the estate's senior guards, his expression tight with urgency rather than threat. "You're safe," he said quickly. "We have you." Behind them, shouts continued as several guards pursued the two men who had grabbed her, though Elena caught only fragments of the chaos, her body finally beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. Priya reached her moments later, pulling her into a tight, trembling embrace. "I heard you shout," Priya said, her voice unsteady. "I didn't know what was happening. I just ran." "You saved me," Elena said, still catching her breath. "If you hadn't come outside when you did." She did not finish the thought, the possibility too unsettling to voice aloud. Word reached Damien within minutes, and Elena had never seen him move with such urgency, arriving at the hall breathless, in a way that felt entirely unlike the composed, controlled man she had come to know. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, pulling her into his arms without a single word, his relief so palpable it seemed to steady the last of her trembling nerves. "Are you hurt?" he asked, pulling back just enough to study her face, her arms, searching for any sign of injury. "I'm okay," Elena said, though her voice still carried the tremor of adrenaline slowly fading. Priya's scream startled them. "I managed to get free before they could get me into the vehicle." Damien's jaw tightened, a flash of something dangerous crossing his expression, before he carefully controlled it, clearly aware of how frightened Elena already was, without adding his own fury to the moment. The two men? Escaped, one of the guards reported grimly, jogging up to join them. They had a vehicle waiting. We recovered a partial plate, but they were gone before we could catch them. Find out everything you can, Damien said, his voice low and controlled, in a way that somehow felt more unsettling than if he had shouted. I want to know who sent them within the hour. Though no name had been confirmed, Elena did not need confirmation to know exactly who was behind the attempt. The memory of Victor Kane's cold smile, his carefully worded warning about bonds facing unexpected challenges, settled heavily over her thoughts. That evening, once the estate had been secured further, and Elena had finally stopped shaking, Damien sat beside her in the quiet of their private rooms, his hand resting gently over hers. I should never have allowed you to attend that meeting outside the estate grounds without additional security, he said, guilt evident in his voice. I underestimated how quickly Victor might act. This isn't your fault, Elena said firmly, surprising herself with how certain she felt saying it. You didn't put those men on that path. Victor did. I still should have protected you better. You did protect me, Elena said. You built a life here, where I learned to protect myself, where Priya cared enough to come looking for me, where guards responded within seconds, instead of ignoring the situation entirely. That's more protection than I've had my whole life. Damien studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a mixture of admiration and quiet anger, directed entirely at the man who had dared to threaten what he valued most. This will not go unanswered, he said. Victor Kane has made a mistake he will come to regret. Elena felt a flicker of fear at the implication, uncertain what consequences might follow. But beneath that fear, she also felt something else entirely new. She had spent her entire life being the person things happened to, without a voice, without protection, without anyone willing to fight on her behalf. Tonight, for the first time, she understood clearly that those days were over. The days following the attempted kidnapping brought a wave of activity throughout the estate. Investigators traced the partial vehicle plate to a rental company, operating near the border of Ashford territory. Though the trail went cold shortly after, the vehicle itself found abandoned and wiped clean of any useful evidence. Still, the timing and location left little room for doubt about who had orchestrated the attempt, even without a signed confession. Damien called an emergency council meeting the following morning, his composure noticeably harder than usual. The warmth Elena had grown used to replaced by a cold, focused determination. Elena attended this time without hesitation, no longer content to simply be discussed rather than included. The evidence, while circumstantial, points clearly toward Ashford, Marin reported, laying out documents across the long table. The vehicle, the timing so soon after Victor's visit, the specific mention of his name during the attempted abduction itself. Circumstantial is not the same as proof, Callum said carefully, though his earlier skepticism toward Elena had long since transformed into genuine concern. If we act without solid confirmation, we risk starting a conflict Ashford could later claim was unprovoked. They attempted to kidnap my mate in broad daylight, Damien said, his voice deceptively even. I do not intend to wait for a formal confession before taking this seriously. No one is suggesting inaction, Marin said. Only caution in how that action is taken. Elena listened carefully, absorbing the careful balance of political strategy, weighed against genuine danger, a balance she was only beginning to understand the complexity of. She thought of the young Omegas she had been teaching just before the attack, the fear that had gripped her chest as those two men tried to force her into a vehicle, and the sharp, unfamiliar strength she had discovered in herself in that moment. May I say something? Elena asked, drawing several surprised glances around the table, though Damien nodded immediately, encouraging her to continue. I understand the need for caution, she said, but I also think there's something important being overlooked here. Victor didn't just target me because I'm connected to Damien through the bond. He targeted me because he assumed I would be an easy target, weak, unprotected, someone who could be taken without consequence. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. If the response to this is only careful diplomatic caution, it confirms exactly what he assumed, that I'm a vulnerability to be managed, rather than a person who fought back and nearly got away entirely on my own before anyone else arrived. The room fell quiet for a moment, several council members exchanging thoughtful glances. What are you suggesting? Marin asked. I'm suggesting that whatever official response Ashford receives, it should make clear that targeting me was not the strategic advantage Victor assumed it would be, Elena said. Not because I want revenge, but because if he believes he can try again with less resistance next time, he will. Damien studied her with an expression that mixed pride with quiet concern. You're not wrong, he said, but I won't put you in a position of danger to prove a point. I'm not asking to be put in danger, Elena clarified. I'm asking to be included in whatever response happens, rather than protected from the conversation entirely. I've spent my whole life being talked about instead of talked to. I don't want that here. Marin nodded slowly, a flicker of genuine respect crossing her sharp features. A fair request, and one I believe most of this council can agree to. The discussion that followed grew more strategic, weighing options between formal diplomatic protest, increased border security, and a private message directly to Victor Kane, one that would make clear the consequences of any further attempts without escalating into open conflict immediately. Elena remained engaged throughout, offering perspective when relevant, listening carefully when the discussion moved into territory she did not yet fully understand. By the meeting's end, a plan had taken shape. A formal diplomatic message would be sent to Ashford, demanding accountability for the attempted abduction, paired with a private warning delivered through more informal channels, one that left no ambiguity about the personal consequences Victor Kane would face if he attempted anything similar again. Meanwhile, security around Elena and around the broader territory would increase substantially, though Damien promised her firmly that increased protection would not mean confinement. You will not become a prisoner in your own home because of his actions, Damien said afterward, once the council had dispersed. I refuse to let his cruelty shrink the life you've only just begun building here. Elena appreciated the promise, though she knew practically that some restrictions were unavoidable for the time being. Still, she found herself grateful that Damien understood the difference between reasonable caution and the kind of overprotective control that would simply replace one form of powerlessness with another. Over the following days, Elena noticed a subtle shift in how the household staff and council treated her, less like an unexpected addition to be cautiously accepted, and more like someone whose voice genuinely mattered within the walls of the estate. Even Callum, who had been openly skeptical during her first council meeting, began seeking her opinion on matters beyond her own safety, a small but meaningful sign of the trust she had slowly earned. Priya, still shaken from the incident, remained close by Elena's side more often than usual, though Elena appreciated the company, rather than resenting it, as unnecessary hovering. Their bond had deepened considerably since the attack, a friendship built not just on shared circumstances but on genuine care. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't stepped outside when I did, Priya admitted one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden. But you did, Elena said gently, and I got myself most of the way free before that. We make a pretty good team. Priya managed a small smile at that, though the worry didn't fully leave her eyes. Do you think he'll try again, Victor Kane? Elena considered the question honestly. I don't know, but I know I'm not going to spend the rest of my life afraid of that possibility. I spent years being afraid of things I couldn't control, situations other people forced me into without asking what I wanted. I'm done living that way. As the days passed without further incident, a message eventually arrived from Ashford, delivered through formal diplomatic channels, denying any involvement in the attempted abduction and expressing carefully worded regret over the accusation itself. Damien did not believe the denial for a moment, nor did anyone on the council, but the message at least confirmed that the private warning had been received and taken seriously enough to prompt an official response. This isn't over, Damien said quietly, reading through the message a second time in the privacy of their rooms that evening. Victor doesn't back down simply because he's been caught. He'll be more careful next time, not less determined. I know, Elena said, but at least now he knows I won't make it easy for him. Damien looked up at her, something warm shifting behind his earlier tension. You already didn't make it easy for him. You very nearly got away entirely on your own. Elena allowed herself a small, proud smile at the memory, the fear of that moment slowly transforming into something closer to strength each time she recalled it. I had good teachers, she said. Priya's self-defense lessons came in useful sooner than either of us expected. Remind me to thank her properly, Damien said, though the humor in his voice did little to fully mask the protective tension still lingering beneath it. That night, as Elena lay beside him, the weight of the past week's events slowly settling into something she could finally begin processing without immediate panic, she found herself thinking not of fear, but of resolve. Victor Kane had underestimated her once already, assuming her position as an Omega, as someone new to this world of politics and power, made her an easy target. He would not make that mistake without consequence again. Elena closed her eyes, Damien's steady presence beside her a quiet reminder that she was no longer facing the world alone, unseen, unwanted. Whatever Victor Kane planned next, she intended to meet it not as the frightened, overlooked Omega she had once been, but as someone who had already proven, twice now, that she was far stronger than anyone had ever given her credit for. 2 months passed with no further incidents, though the quiet did little to ease the tension that had settled permanently over the estate. Damien remained watchful. Marin continued monitoring reports from the border, and Elena, though grateful for the peace, could not fully shake the feeling that Victor Kane was simply waiting for a better opportunity, rather than abandoning his plans entirely. That opportunity, it seemed, arrived disguised as diplomacy. A formal invitation reached the estate one morning, requesting Damien's presence at a regional summit meant to address trade disputes among several neighboring territories, including Ashford. The location, a neutral meeting ground along the border shared by multiple territories, had been used for similar gatherings for generations, considered safe under long-standing agreements that prohibited hostility on its grounds. "I don't like it," Damien said, reading through the invitation a second time at the breakfast table. "The timing is too convenient." "You think Victor arranged this?" Elena asked. "I think Victor rarely does anything without a specific outcome in mind," Damien said. Refusing the summit, however, would draw unwanted attention, particularly from the other territories, who have no direct involvement in our dispute with Ashford. "It would look as though I were avoiding him out of fear." "Are you going?" Elena asked, already suspecting the answer. "I have to," Damien said. "But you are not coming with me." Elena had expected the statement, though it did little to soften her frustration. "I understand the danger," she said carefully. "But I also understand that hiding me away every time Victor makes a move only teaches him that his tactics are working." "This isn't about teaching him a lesson," Damien said, his voice firmer than usual. "This is about keeping you safe from a man who has already tried once to hurt you." Elena wanted to argue further, but she recognized the genuine fear beneath his firmness, the same fear she had seen the day he arrived breathless at the community hall after her attempted abduction. She relented, though the decision sat uneasily with her. The morning Damien departed for the summit, Elena stood at the estate's entrance, watching the small convoy of vehicles disappear down the long drive, flanked by additional guards Damien had insisted on bringing despite the summit's supposed neutrality. Marin remained behind at the estate, tasked with overseeing Elena's safety in Damien's absence, though even she seemed unusually tense as the vehicles vanished from sight. The day passed slowly, Elena unable to focus fully on anything, her mind circling back repeatedly to the summit taking place miles away. She tried distracting herself with the community program, with quiet conversations with Priya, but the unease never fully faded. It was late afternoon when the first signs of trouble arrived, not through official word from the summit, but through a frantic call one of the guards received, the color draining from his face as he listened. "What is it?" Marin demanded immediately, noticing the shift in his expression. "There's been an incident at the summit," the guard said, his voice tight. "A disturbance broke out near the meeting hall. Details are still unclear, but early reports suggest His Majesty's convoy was targeted on the return route." Elena's heart dropped. "Targeted how? Is he hurt?" "We don't know yet," the guard admitted. "Communication from the convoy has been inconsistent." The following hour felt like the longest of Elena's life, every minute stretching unbearably, as Marin worked to gather more information, contacting allies stationed near the summit grounds, coordinating with additional guards to prepare for whatever might be needed. Elena paced the length of the estate's main hall, refusing offers to retreat to her rooms, unwilling to hide away, while Damien's fate remained uncertain. Finally, word arrived that the convoy had been located, though the news brought only partial relief. The vehicles had been ambushed along a stretch of road bordering Ashford territory, a coordinated attack that had clearly been planned in advance despite the summit's supposed neutrality. Several guards had been injured in the initial confrontation, though early reports confirmed Damien himself remained alive, currently engaged in a tense standoff rather than an active battle. I need to go there, Elena said immediately, the words leaving her before she had fully considered the danger involved. Absolutely not, Maren said firmly. Walking into an active standoff is exactly what Victor would want, another opportunity to use you against Damien. And leaving him out there without every possible advantage isn't an option either, Elena argued. You said yourself, bonds carry a certain strength. If Victor is trying to weaken Damien's position by threatening me, wouldn't my presence, safely coordinated rather than reckless, actually reinforce the strength of that bond instead? Maren hesitated, clearly weighing the unconventional logic against the obvious risk. I'm not suggesting I walk in there alone and unprotected, Elena continued quickly. I'm suggesting we use every resource available, including whatever strength this bond actually provides, rather than assuming my only useful role is staying safely out of the way. After a tense discussion and additional confirmation from contacts near the summit that the standoff, while dangerous, had not yet turned violent, Maren reluctantly agreed to a carefully coordinated plan, one that would bring Elena close enough to the situation to be useful without placing her directly in the line of danger unnecessarily. The drive to the border felt endless, tension coiling tighter in Elena's chest with every passing mile. When they finally arrived, the scene before her confirmed every fear she had carried since the guard's initial frantic call. Several vehicles from Damien's convoy sat damaged along the roadside, guards positioned cautiously around the perimeter, weapons lowered but ready. At the center of the standoff stood Damien, facing Victor Kane directly, the tension between them palpable even from a distance. You've made your point, Victor, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the tense space. An ambush disguised as a summit dispute. Impressive, though not particularly subtle. I only wanted to demonstrate a simple truth, Victor said, his earlier polished charm replaced with something colder, more openly hostile. Bonds are wonderful things, Damien, right up until the moment they become a liability. How distracted have you been these past months, worrying over a mate who cannot even properly defend herself? Elena, watching from a careful distance beside Maren, felt fury replace fear entirely. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, drawing immediate, startled attention from both sides of the standoff. Elena, no, Maren began, but Elena had already moved beyond hearing distance, walking steadily toward the tense scene ahead. Damien's expression shifted instantly to alarm the moment he saw her. Elena, get back. I'm not a liability, Elena said, addressing Victor directly, her voice steady despite the danger surrounding her. And I'm certainly not someone who needs to be discussed, as though I'm not capable of speaking for myself. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with renewed interest. The Omega returns, he said, braver than I expected, though bravery alone rarely wins confrontations like this. I'm not here to fight you, Elena said. I'm here because you clearly believe threatening me weakens him. It doesn't. If anything, every attempt you've made has only proven how much stronger this bond is than you assumed. Careful, Victor warned, though something in his confident posture had shifted slightly, uncertain. You had 2 men grab me off a quiet path months ago, Elena continued, refusing to back down despite the danger radiating from every guard positioned around them. I nearly got away entirely on my own before anyone else arrived. Today, you arranged an ambush disguised as diplomacy, assuming that threatening me directly would finally break whatever advantage you believe this bond gives him. But all you've actually proven, twice now, is that I'm not the easy target you assumed I would be. The standoff held for a long, tense moment, every guard on both sides watching carefully, weapons still raised but hesitant. Victor studied Elena with an unreadable expression, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he had walked into this confrontation believing would succeed. An interesting bluff, Victor said finally, though his voice carried less certainty than before. It's not a bluff, Damien said, stepping closer to Elena's side now, his earlier alarm replaced with quiet, controlled fury, directed entirely at Victor. You've spent months underestimating someone who has already proven, repeatedly, exactly how much strength you failed to recognize. I suggest you reconsider whatever plan you believed today's confrontation would accomplish. Victor's gaze shifted between them, weighing the situation carefully. Whatever advantage he had hoped an ambush disguised as diplomatic tension might provide, had clearly failed to materialize the way he intended, especially with Elena's unexpected arrival, disrupting whatever calculated intimidation he had planned. "This isn't finished," Victor said finally, though the words carried less conviction than his earlier threats. "No," Damien agreed, "but it is finished today." Victor Kane retreated with his delegation shortly after, though the tension surrounding his departure remained heavy in the air, long after his vehicles disappeared down the border road. Damien's guards worked quickly to secure the area, tending to those injured during the initial ambush, while Marin coordinated communication back to the estate to confirm everyone's safety. Elena stood quietly at the edge of the clearing, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation slowly beginning to fade, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion she hadn't expected. Damien crossed the distance between them the moment the immediate danger had passed, pulling her into a tight embrace that said more than words could have managed. "You shouldn't have come," he said, though there was no real anger behind the words, only lingering fear finally allowed to surface now that the danger had passed. "I couldn't stay away," Elena admitted, her voice muffled against his shoulder, "not knowing whether you were safe." "You could have been hurt," Damien said. "Victor is not a man who hesitates when given the right opportunity." "I know," Elena said, pulling back just enough to look at him directly. "But I also know that hiding wasn't going to protect either of us. He wanted to prove the bond was a weakness. I couldn't let that happen from a distance." Damien studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, admiration slowly overtaking the last of his fear. "You are the least predictable person I have ever met," he said finally, a small, exhausted smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that a compliment?" Elena asked. "It's the highest compliment I know how to give," Damien said. The journey back to the estate felt entirely different from the anxious drive that had brought Elena to the border only hours earlier. Though exhaustion weighed heavily over the convoy, a quiet sense of relief settled over the group as well, the immediate threat neutralized, even if the larger conflict with Ashford remained unresolved. Once safely back within the estate walls, the council convened briefly to discuss the day's events, though Damien insisted the full debrief wait until morning, prioritizing rest and recovery for everyone involved, particularly the guards injured during the initial ambush. Elena, despite her own exhaustion, found herself unable to fully relax until she had personally checked on each of them, offering quiet gratitude for their protection throughout the ordeal. That night, as the estate finally settled into a rare, peaceful quiet, Elena sat with Damien in their private rooms, the events of the day replaying slowly in her mind. "Do you think he'll try again?" she asked, watching the flickering candlelight cast soft shadows across the room. "Eventually, perhaps," Damien said honestly, though I suspect today altered his calculations considerably. Victor built his entire strategy around the assumption that you would remain a vulnerability he could exploit. You proved otherwise, in front of his own delegation. "I didn't do it alone," Elena said. "You stood beside me the entire time." "And you stood beside me," Damien said. "That's rather the point, isn't it? A bond built on genuine partnership, rather than one person protecting the other from a distance." Elena considered his words carefully, thinking back over the past months, the wedding hall she had walked away from, the estate she had slowly come to call home, the community program that had given her purpose beyond simply surviving each day. She thought of the fear she had carried during the attempted kidnapping, transformed slowly into strength through Priya's patient teaching. She thought of the confrontation at the border, the moment she had stepped forward despite every instinct telling her to remain safely hidden away. "I used to think strength meant never needing anyone else," Elena said quietly. "That relying on people only gave them power over you. That's what I learned growing up. But these past months have taught me something different." "What's that?" Damien asked. "That real strength isn't about facing everything alone," Elena said. "It's about choosing who stands beside you, and trusting that choice enough to let them in." Damien reached over, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his expression softening into something Elena had come to recognize as genuine, uncomplicated affection, free from the political calculations that governed so much of his daily life. "I am endlessly grateful," he said, "that the bond chose you." "I'm grateful it chose both of us," Elena said, "even if it interrupted my wedding to do it." A soft laugh escaped Damien, the tension of the day finally beginning to fully release from his shoulders. In hindsight, I suppose that entrance could have been slightly less dramatic. I don't know, Elena said, a small smile finally breaking through her own exhaustion. It certainly made an impression. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of the day's danger slowly giving way to quiet gratitude for having survived it together. Elena thought of how far she had come since that morning in the wedding hall, terrified and resigned to a life she believed she had no power to change. She thought of every small victory since then, learning to defend herself, finding her voice within the council, standing her ground against a ruler who had underestimated her at every turn. She was no longer the Omega nobody wanted, overlooked and undervalued by everyone around her. She had become someone capable of walking into danger for the people she cared about, someone whose voice carried weight in rooms that had once ignored her entirely. The following morning brought official word that Ashford had issued a formal apology regarding the disturbance at the summit, carefully worded to avoid direct acknowledgement of the ambush itself, though the message's underlying meaning was clear enough to everyone who read it. Victor Kane, at least for now, appeared unwilling to escalate the conflict further, likely recalculating his strategy after the unexpected strength Elena had displayed at the border. Marin delivered the news during a brief morning meeting, her earlier caution toward Elena long since replaced with clear respect. Whatever else Victor Kane decides to attempt in the future, she said, he will not soon forget what happened yesterday. Let's hope that means he thinks twice before trying again, Callum added, though even his usual skepticism carried a note of genuine relief. Elena listened to the discussion with a quiet sense of accomplishment, no longer feeling like an outsider awkwardly included in conversations about her own safety, but as a genuine, respected member of the household and council alike. The road ahead likely still held challenges, threats from Ashford potentially resurfacing in new forms, the ongoing complexities of adjusting fully to her new role within Damien's territory. But for the first time since walking away from her own wedding months earlier, Elena faced that uncertain future without fear. She faced it with quiet, unshakable confidence. Months passed, and the tension surrounding Ashford gradually settled into a wary, distant peace. Victor Kane made no further attempts against Elena or the territory, though Damien's council remained cautious, aware that a man like Victor rarely abandoned ambition entirely, only postponed it when circumstances no longer favored him. Still, life within the estate slowly returned to a steadier rhythm, one built on genuine safety rather than constant vigilance. Elena's community program had grown considerably since its small beginnings, now welcoming young Omegas from across the territory, many of whom had heard stories of the Omega who had stood her ground against an Alpha King's rival, refusing to be treated as anything less than capable and valued. Elena never sought that reputation deliberately, but she found quiet pride in knowing her own story had become a source of hope for others who had once felt as invisible as she once had. One afternoon, as she sat organizing lesson plans for the following week, Priya arrived with an excited, knowing smile that immediately caught Elena's attention. "His Majesty is looking for you," Priya said. He seemed rather insistent. Elena found Damien waiting in the private garden behind the estate, the same quiet space where they had first spoken honestly about the bond that connected them, months earlier. The garden had changed with the season. Flowers Elena had once admired, now replaced with new blooms, though the peaceful atmosphere remained exactly as she remembered. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, walking toward him. "I did," Damien said, turning to face her fully, an unfamiliar nervousness flickering across his usually composed expression. "I've been thinking about the day we met, about how it began." "Please don't remind me of the dress," Elena said, a small laugh escaping her. "I still can't look at white flowers the same way." "That's rather the point I wanted to address," Damien said, a soft smile breaking through his nervousness. "You never had the chance to choose your own wedding. Every part of that day was decided for you, by other people, for reasons that had nothing to do with what you actually wanted." Elena's breath caught slightly, understanding beginning to dawn, as Damien reached into his coat, producing a small, simple box. "I don't want our story to be remembered only as the day a wedding was stopped," he said. "I want it to include the day you chose, fully and completely, on your own terms, to build a life with me. Not because a bond decided it, not because anyone else arranged it, because you wanted it." He opened the box, revealing a ring far simpler than Elena might have expected from an Alpha King. Understated and elegant, clearly chosen with careful thought, rather than mere extravagance. "Elena Voss," Damien said, "will you marry me? Not as payment for anyone's debts, not as a political arrangement, simply because it's what you want, for yourself." Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly, the weight of months of transformation settling fully into this single moment. She thought of the girl who had stood at another altar entirely, resigned to a life she believed she had no power to change. She thought of everything since, the strength she had discovered within herself, the family she had built within this estate, the partnership she had come to trust more deeply than she ever imagined possible. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and certain. "Yes, I will." The wedding that followed, held weeks later, bore little resemblance to the ceremony Elena had once stood through in quiet resignation. This time, she chose everything herself. The modest, intimate guest list filled only with people who genuinely mattered to her. Priya standing proudly beside her, Marin and Callum seated among trusted friends, rather than calculating politicians. Her father was not invited, a decision Elena made peacefully, rather than out of lingering anger, simply because this day belonged entirely to the life she had built for herself, not the one that had once been forced upon her. The ceremony took place in the same garden where Damien had proposed, decorated simply with flowers Elena had chosen herself, the late afternoon sun casting warm golden light across the small gathering. Elena wore a dress far simpler than the elaborate gown from her first almost wedding, one that felt entirely like her own, rather than a costume assigned to fulfill someone else's expectations. As she walked toward Damien, surrounded by people who had earned her trust through genuine care rather than obligation, Elena felt none of the dread that had gripped her months earlier at that other altar. Instead, she felt a quiet, steady joy, the kind that came from choosing her own life fully and completely. Halden, the same officiant who had once begun a ceremony that never finished, stood ready once more, though this time his voice carried genuine warmth rather than the formal detachment of that earlier, unwanted union. "We are gathered here," he began, "to witness a bond built not on obligation, but on choice." Elena listened to the familiar words, transformed now into something entirely new, meaningful in a way they had never been before. When Halden turned to her, asking if she came to this binding freely, with her heart and her word, Elena did not hesitate. "I do," she said, her voice steady, filled with a certainty she had never felt standing at that other altar. Damien's eyes softened as he repeated the same vow, his voice carrying the same quiet steadiness that had first drawn her to trust him, months earlier, in a hall filled with strangers who had never truly seen her value. As they exchanged their final vows, Elena thought back to the frightened, overlooked Omega who had once believed a loveless marriage was the best she could hope for. She thought of every whispered insult, every moment of feeling invisible, every arrangement made without her voice ever mattering. None of that defined her anymore. She was no longer the Omega nobody wanted, left standing at an altar meant to serve someone else's purpose. She was a woman who had fought for her own worth, who had built a life filled with genuine friendship, purpose, and love, who had stood her ground against a ruler who once believed her weak, and who now stood freely, joyfully, choosing her own future with her whole heart. When Halden finally pronounced them bonded, the small garden erupted into warm applause, genuine joy filling the space in a way that had been entirely absent from that first unwanted ceremony. Damien pulled Elena close, and as their lips met, she felt every lingering shadow from her old life finally, completely fade away. Later that evening, as the small celebration continued beneath string lights scattered throughout the garden, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Priya, watching the joyful gathering from a peaceful distance. "Can you believe this is the same person who once believed she'd never be truly wanted?" Priya asked, gently nudging Elena's shoulder. Elena smiled, watching Damien laugh warmly with Callum nearby, the ease between them a far cry from the tense uncertainty of their first meeting. "I think I always wanted to be wanted," she said. "I just never believed I deserved it." "And now?" Priya asked. Elena looked around at the small, genuine gathering surrounding her, people who had chosen to stand beside her not out of obligation, but out of real care and respect. She thought of the young Omegas in her program, learning each week that their worth was never something to be decided by anyone else. She thought of Damien, who had walked into a wedding hall meant for someone else, and had never once tried to control her choices, only to support them fully. Now, Elena said, I know exactly what I deserve, and for the first time in my life, I have it. As the celebration continued late into the evening, laughter and warmth filling the garden long after the sun had fully set, Elena Voss stood surrounded by a life she had chosen entirely for herself, no longer the Omega nobody wanted, but a woman who had proven, again and again, exactly how much she was worth. And for the first time in her life, she believed it completely.